be here. I went to my first Making Money Make Change in 2003.
Woo!
And yes, I was 23 years old, and I had read a book called No More Prisons by Billy Wimsatt. And in that book, there was a chapter called The Cool Rich Kids Movement. And I really wanted to be cool, definitely knew that. I really did not want to be a rich kid, but it sounded really interesting, this unique space to talk about class and money and wealth in the context of the movements I wanted to be part of. So it turned out my sister's best friend from high school was on the board, Mahaya Campbell. I called her up and I said, "Are these good folks?" She said, "Yes, I'll be there, you should come." And so I went, and it changed my life. And I am so happy to be here to welcome you into this work. I've been on text threads over the past 24 hours with board and staff from my time at Resource Generation, and everybody's texting photos and videos of them with their kids. And so I just want you to know that this is a place where the people you meet here 20 years from now, you could be texting with, and they could be some of your dear friends, that even if you don't see them all the time, that you love because of the important things that you've done here together. A little bit more about me. After I went to MMC, I spent 6 years as a chapter leader and a member in the Bay Area, and 6 years on the staff. I was the family philanthropy organizer, the co-director, and the associate director. And these days, I run and sort of organize a multimedia project called Organize the Rich, trying to document the histories and the lineage and the legacies of this work of organizing wealthy people on the side of working class-led multiracial movements for justice. Yeah, I love that project too. Let's see if I had anything else to say there. No, done with that one. I have these little cards. So I just wanted to do a thing. I think Yaya might have done this, but I'm gonna have us do it again, which is, who for you is this your very first MMC? Let's give those people a big cheer. Welcome, yes. Just by being here today, you are part of this lineage, you're part of this work. Who is this your second or third time? Yes, thank you for coming back. Who is this your fourth, fifth, or more time? Yes. And raise your hand if someone in the room made a difference for you showing up here today. Yes. And raise your hand if you made a difference for someone else showing up here today.
Oh.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. So the goals of our time together, you can go to the next slide. Are for you all to feel welcome into and part of a long history of efforts to organize the rich towards justice, to get a chance to reflect on your own mentors and lineage, to hear a few key stories from the history of this work and leave curious to learn more, and think about how you want to plug into this history and help carry it forward. We have just like an incredible panel. Me and Yaya got to meet months ago and think about who are some of our favorite people that could help welcome you all in. And we have Chuck Collins, Hez Norton, and Nicole Lewis joining me and Yaya in that, and I'm so delighted to have them here. And I just want to give a little note, warning sort of thing. Like, this is like, I learned this term when I was watching Top Chef in the 2000s, amuse-bouche. It's like a little appetizer. Like, this is going to be a teaser. It's like a little treat. You're going to be like, I want to know more, tell me more. And it's not going to be complete in any way. You're just going to get little drops of really interesting history that I hope you follow up with each of these people or look up yourself, because we're not going to be able to go as fully into the many, many things as we want to. Okay, we're doing the things. Also, I'm going to interrupt them with a timer and be really rude, and that's just how it's going to go. So just to start by kicking us off, we're going to have you turn to somebody in the room, not yet, and do 2 minutes each talking about a similar question that you asked earlier, but I think we can't look at this enough, which is, who is responsible for you being here today? And that could be both literally who helped you get here, but who in your family, who in your lineage, who in your chosen family, who in your chosen lineage has helped you be here today. Because all of you have an incredibly powerful lineage that you're showing up here with. and we want to be able to share those with each other, even while we're the ones up on the stage here. So why don't we take a few minutes, turn to somebody, I'll let you know. We're going to ask them their name, their gender pronoun, where they live, their age. They know these, so they don't, it's a lot, You don't have to memorize it. How many times they've been to MMC, and who is responsible for you being here today. And they're each gonna have a couple minutes each. And just so you know more about me, Michael Gast, he, him, Oakland, California, 44 years old, middle-aged, proudly. And I've been to MMC a bunch. I don't know how many, but between 5 and 10. All right, I'm gonna pass it to Chuck Collins.
Hi everybody, Chuck Collins, he, him. I come from southern Vermont. There's a bunch of Vermonters here, over-representing our share of the population. But I've lived in Jamaica Plain, Boston for decades and decades. And let's see, I just turned 65, not retiring, gonna keep at it. And I have, this is probably like the 7th or 8th MMC. I was at some of the very early ones. And one of my connections is I was around when Resource Generation was starting, but I was always like 2 years too old to be a member. So at one point the threshold was like 25 and I was 28 and then whatever. So I never could fully join. But there was a sort of, I'll talk a little bit about a pre-formation that was like that. And then I think the people who got me here, I kind of imagined it like a little altar, you know, with, so Oscar Mayer, the meat packer, is definitely one of the reasons I'm here. He's the source of the wealth. Then there was like this first generation of these sort of funding exchange donor organizers, George Pillsbury, who totally took one for the team by just being public and ridiculed as the doughboy wherever he went, you know. And Janet Axelrod, who was the first director of Haymarket, and a guy named Chuck Feeney, who is a billionaire who actually pledged to give away all his wealth, and he did. Then he died a year ago. Wow. And then the other person is Michael Gast. And I would just lift up that Michael now is kind of playing a really important role in collecting stories and this lineage and having us have these conversations. So go Michael. And if you haven't subscribed to Organize the Rich, the blog, you should do it, because that's where this legacy and lineage is living on. And he's really asking, like, some of us can't remember the history, but he's actually getting it down. So that's great.
Hey y'all, my name is Hez, I use they, them, and I live in Boston, Jamaica Plain. I was executive director of RG from 2000 to 2005, so I followed the founding director, Tracy Hewitt. Some of the people, how I'm here. Hundreds of queer young people in North Carolina that I worked with in the 90s, who were my teachers. Southerners on New Ground, the founders, Suzanne Farr, Joan Gardner, Matt Seagrass, and Mandy Carter. Funding exchange folks, Ellen Grzinski, Tema Oken, and Kenneth Jones. Tema was my mentor in the 90s. How lucky was I to have Tema Oken as a mentor when I was starting a queer youth organization back then. Who else? Mike, Tracy Hewitt, Chuck Collins. Lots of wealthy young folks that my background is not wealthy, lots of wealthy young folks who I met during that time and learned from and organized with, and raised some hell with. So I'm here. So thanks.
So nice to hear the stories. Hey everybody, I'm Nicole Lewis. Forget which order you said them in. 37. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. This is probably, I was trying to count, probably my 6th MMC, including being here last year as part of this panel, or I guess it was more of a smaller group last year. And there are many people who are responsible for me being here. I'll start with one, Laura Wernick, who, when I was at the University of Michigan, was writing her doctoral thesis on the organization and on the organizing model, and sent me as like a 20 I don't even think I could drink yet. A 20-year-old, a 21-year-old, to MMC for the first time. And so that sort of just opened up my whole world, and then I wound up joining the staff later that year after I graduated. And the other person I'm thinking of is my great-grandmother, who was a lawyer, and along with her husband, my grandfather, organized a ton in Philadelphia for, equal opportunity for Black folks, desegregating theaters, in some cases representing people who committed crime. So just a wide range of really important legal work that I think really paved the way for my own scholarship and thinking and organizing.
Thanks, y'all. And hi, everyone. I'm Yaya. I take they, them pronouns. I live in Austin, New York. My 10th MMC, including a couple virtual ones. And I'm 33 years old, so I got a few more years as a constituent. I think about my mom, who I think is who I really inherited activism and my mom's an activist, not an organizer, but a desire to change the world, right, and to be vocal about it. And my dad for giving me a complex about being wealthy and just needing to figure out what to do about that. And then I think specifically, Jessie Spector was the 2 EDs before me, and was the ED when I was hired. She and I went to the same high school, so I have an email from 2010 when I was in college that was like, hey Jessie, my friend's about to have a trust fund. I don't have one, but maybe someday, can we talk? And then I was a college student and we never had a one-to-one. I completely ghosted on an email chain. And then I applied to work at RG 4 years later. The hiring committee was Mitch Garage, Caitlin Gravitt, Yimei Ho, Sarah Abbott, who were definitely folks that I learned from as I was joining the staff at 24 years old. I'm in the direct lineage of Nicole Lewis, who was the first people of color organizer on staff, followed by Mitch Garage. And then I was hired as the national organizer and coordinator of people of color programs. And I was in that role for about 5 years.
I love that. Great. Okay. So now I'm going to try to breathe while I give you a little bit of my brief, wildly incomplete history of organizing the rich for justice. Thank you. And then we're going to move on to each one of these panelists talking about a little bit of a different era in this work to give you a little bit of the appetizer for what different eras of this work look like and what you're all building off of. Because this goal is that you all make bolder, more grounded, more connected experiments in the next period, in the hard times that we're in, based on all of the stuff that we and many other people in this room have done. And I really want that for you. And I want you to know what we've tried before so you can do more interesting things in the future. Okay, so let's go to, I made a slideshow because I'm a dork like that. Okay, so the first slide, go to the next one, is individuals and small groups. So ChatGPT or Claude AI, one of these, told me that class societies are about 5,000 years old, right? And I just want to say, since the beginning of class societies, there's been individuals and small groups of wealthy people that have been being class traders, that have been trying to work for justice and equity and the collective good. Some of these people include Moses, an early rich kid, didn't know what he was doing, saw inequality around him, lashed out against the oppressors, was marginalized, ran away from his wealthy community, and then came back and tried to figure out how to leverage his privilege for social change. Exactly. We have Madam C.J. Walker, in the Guinness Book of World Records as the first female millionaire, thank you very much, a Black woman who started a business, and as she was making lots of money, was giving it to anti-lynching efforts, holding civil rights, Black liberation meetings in her home, and doing a whole bunch of important work. We have Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who was from a Brahmin family, a very wealthy family in India, who was doing feminist labor organizing in her home, and actually being somebody that would negotiate with the bosses for the workers alongside the workers in those negotiations for labor contracts. We also have my Jewish brother, Julius Rosenwald, who started one of the early social justice foundations, and one of my favorite examples, the Mink Brigade, because that's a great name, the Mink Brigade. And these were wealthy women, including the daughter of J.P. Morgan, who would go stand on the picket lines with the garment workers so that they weren't beat up by the cops. And did this consistently through the winter in the 1920s or something like that. So these are some examples of the individuals and small groups. All right, next slide. So then in the 70s is the first time, at least in my knowledge, at least in the US that I know, that things got formalized. The first proto-MMC, the first rich kid conferences were in the early 70s, and they were called ARF, Amalgamated Rich Folks. And the other nickname they called them were BARF, Beautiful Amalgamated Rich Folks. Just like some of us, they were young, wealthy progressives from colleges like Middlebury that got together. They were radicalized by the Black liberation movement, the Civil Rights movement, the Women's Rights movement, all the movements of the 60s to say we need to be on the side of the people. And they got together and started to figure out what the F that meant. And they started, things go on to the next slide. They started a bunch of foundations like the Vanguard Foundation and others. Its innovation was basically, we'll raise the money as young wealthy people and we'll give it to leaders in the communities that are being funded to decide where it goes. And these foundations they barnstormed around the country setting up these foundations, and those became known as the funding exchange. So if you hear that word, the funding exchange, that's what we're talking about. It's this group of foundations around the country that did that work. There was some wealthy people in that community that were like, we need more spiritual work, we need more time together to really ground in our emotions. They created Threshold Foundation and did there's a whole lineage of Threshold Foundation. All right, so that's that one. Next one. Alongside these rich revolutionaries from the 70s to the 90s comes neoliberalism, and which basically means that it's a movement to have less regulations on business so that rich people can make more money. And it means that there was privatization. That means lots of things were privatized to be able to not be at the responsibility of the government and to be the responsibility of nonprofits and big philanthropy to cover. And so this is, and during this time there's growing wealth inequality. So at the same time we're starting to see some formalization of these rich people revolutionaries, we're also seeing growing inequality and around the world. All right, done. Move on. Then we have the 90s and the 2000s, new experiments, growing numbers, and this is when RG was formed. And basically, the young rich kids that started out in the 70s, being like the young radicals, were suddenly middle-aged like me, and they were like, oh, we need like another generation of young wealthy people to help fund these movements, and we're going to start Resource Generation. And so Resource Generation started, first known as Comfort Zone in '95, and became Resource Generation after that. I, for some time, thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. They were sincere. It was important to have safe spaces, and they moved to an organizing model after that. But other groups that were founded in that time, Women Donors Network, Responsible Wealth, that Chuck was a part of, and this great book was published, Classified, How to Stop Hiding Your Privilege and Use It for Social Change. Right, let's move on. So that neoliberal sort of like winning thing sort of crashes and burns in 2008. There's a huge stock market collapse. All of you lived through this. There was the Occupy movement, and there was RG members like Farhad Ebrahimi on the right and Elspeth Gilmore on the left that went viral by holding up signs saying, I am the 1%, I stand with the 99%, which was a powerful campaign that we helped run. And there was just a broad questioning of capitalism. For the first time in my lifetime, in a way that I'd never seen before, people were like, oh, this shit does not work and we need something different. And so the populist movements of Obama and Trump, which were both outsider candidates, come out of that. And we're still in this populist moment where people are like, oh, things are broken, things are falling apart, we need something different. And people are finding different answers for that question. Right. So 2010s to today are some real boom times for this work. Really important organizations get founded. Solidaire. If you don't know these, you can look them up later. I'm not going to explain what they are, but they're all rich people organizing groups that play important roles in our ecosystem today. Solidaire, an intergenerational network. Patriotic Millionaires, working to raise taxes on the rich. Way to Win and Movement Voter Project, 2 organizations working to move electoral money to grassroots groups. Donors of Color Network, really try to make this much more of a multiracial movement of the rich than we've ever figured out before in the US. And okay, that's who I talked about there. So, you know, this is a little bit of a hyperbolic thing to say, but I think it's true, and I think we have to hold the both and here. This is actually, I think, the biggest movement of rich people towards redistribution, towards working against the system that actually gave us the wealth in the first place that's ever existed in the history of class societies. I think we're actually living in that moment today, and we're part of that. And you all know, it's so small. It's not powerful, it's insufficient, it's not what we need. And so I think I just want to keep on holding the boat, but like really celebrating what we've done and where we've come and how far we've come, and also knowing that we're so far from where we need to be to really have the society we want. And this is, yeah, that's my history. Thank you. Oh, we're back. This is all RG pictures. We've always been primarily led in this work by young people. Young, wealthy people have always led the way in this work. And disproportionately, women have always led the way in this work. Queer people, trans people, genderqueer people, like all the LGBT folks have always led in this work, especially in RG. Jewish people have always been disproportionately represented in leadership in RG, doing brave and bold things. And this work has always gone better when it's been grounded in multiracial, cross-class leadership. That hasn't always been the case in all these experiments, but when it has, it's always been messier and gone better. Full of conflict and full of really important things that we've figured out. So these are some of the people. You can see Hez Norton on the lower left. That's the staff that I came into RG with. Hez Norton, John Harrison, Sally Bouvier, Karen Pittleman, and Allison Goldberg. All right. And a little bit about the larger movement context. And again, just like this, it's going to plant a lot of seeds, but be completely incomplete. All right.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. And if and I would just start by saying there's a history of sort of individuals and class traders, but just to emphasize, maybe it's this stage of late capitalism that we're in, but this idea of people who have benefited from a system that's created these gross inequalities, speaking out and being resisting these inequalities and talking about redistribution and all the institutional forms. It is really unusual. It's actually good news, I find, when talking to other people, to talk about the cracks in this kind of wealth extraction machine, this seemingly impermeable system, and the fact that you're here and that there's a whole other movement of people, these organizations, really, I think, is inspiring to people. So, and I'll just pick up where I left off. I was 18, I went to my first conference that the Haymarket People's Fund organized, which was very much in its culture kind of a predecessor to Making Money, Making Change. There was a great staff out of Boston, the Haymarket People's Fund, that sort of understood the power of getting people together. And for me, coming in there, literally, it was like the first time I ever said, I'm the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, I inherited X $1 billion, I didn't ever have anybody to talk to. So it was really, and there was probably nowhere else that I probably could have gone at that moment. And Haymarket was part of this funding exchange network. There evolved about 15 of these member foundations. Headwaters Fund, where's David, is it? From Minnesota and others. He's, now to come on the Resource Generation Board, bringing some of that funding exchange history. And the funding exchange actually had a national conference with this name like Committee for National Priorities. And it was like, we got together and it was very much, the culture was, you all are the faucet, you're the faucet, and our job is to open up your faucet, and you're just going to fund these social change movements. And there was a sort of Marxist, not a lot of attention to personal relationship, personal issues, and that network, I should say, didn't thrive. I think many of us learned a lot, and a lot of people came to that network, and Michael alluded to this and said, I need a little bit more of a support. I need a little bit more of a community around this experience, and formed the Threshold Network. And the Threshold Network is still going 40 years later. So that attention to culture, and I should say, I think, I talk about, the funding exchange sort of had this Marxist hard line. Your job is to redistribute your wealth and rejoin the working class. I mean, literally, that's what some of the leaders said. And then, the funding threshold, on the other hand, was almost sort of like a completely unaccountable space. I call it the soft pillow. It's safe here, come in, we're the family you never had, kind of sort of feeling. And both those tendencies were really important. And in some ways, I think Resource Generation said, well, we got to have both. We got to have a safe, welcoming place. We got to have a place where people can show up for the first time and have these conversations. And eventually, we should create some accountability between us all about what we're doing here, because owning class people left to our own devices, we're gonna wander off and start something, whatever. But I would, we'll talk about this more, but I think that was one of the things I remember, and has reminded me this, that when she was at Resource Generation, people always were coming to her with like, I want to start this new institute, or I want to start this organizing campaign. It's like, well, you had to talk them down off this, that combination of agency and wealth didn't always end well, the other thing I'll just want to throw in is, I think, as I watch the trajectory now, here we are, whatever, Resource Generation, that blend, that dialectic of support, accountability, disclosure, privacy, challenge, support. I think that is how we evolve and change. And so I think when I see Resource Generation and Solidaire, that paying attention to the culture that is so much a part of this gathering. So it's a much more welcoming, friendly than when I showed up at age 18. I was lucky. I felt lucky. I felt like it saved my life that I could find that other group of people. And one funny thing is, so I actually made this decision to give away the wealth I had, but I was sort of sad because that meant I wouldn't be able to go to these gatherings anymore. And the director of the Haymarket People's Fund said, if you give away all your wealth, you can still come. You don't have to miss out on the connections that you built. And that was good news, actually. So anyway.
So my background prior to RG, which we didn't call RG back then, was Resource Generation, was queer youth organizing, and I want to tell you about that because it wasn't until later on, maybe even in thinking about this, that I kind of noticed the connection. So when I was doing queer youth organizing in North Carolina at the time, there were maybe 3 or 4 support networks for queer youth in North Carolina, but nothing that attended to leadership and organizing. It was all about safety and support. And there were a lot of kick-out queer young people out there that were like, we're ready to lead and organize, but there's no place for us to get that kind of training and be safe. And so that's what we created back in the 90s, was a leadership and organizing network. So I moved to Boston, and from North Carolina, I didn't have a job, and somehow got connected to RG and saw like wealthy people organizing. Okay, I'll try it. I had no idea what I was signing myself up for at all, right? Just didn't know what I was about to step into. A few things that I remember that still stick with me. One is that a lot of my organizer friends were like, you're selling out. This is selling out. it was deep to me to just be like, oh wow, like this, like these are people who are organizers, who are, these are folks who have resources and have different class privilege and have just, all that kind of stuff. But that was an interesting message early on for my fellow organizers who were not wealthy to be giving me that message and speaking to the intensity of the class divide and what needed to be worked on. Secondly, like pretty early on, I was like, oh shit, we are gonna have a lot of phone calls from people who want to start something, and a big part of my job was like, hey, that is a great idea, and I think there's probably about a few thousand other people that have it, and how about we also find them and connect you to them. That lessened over time. I came to understand also pretty quickly is that, this work is about relationships. Moving money is relational, and it's a form of expressing that relationship, and a form of moving money. And justice is about the core of it is about relationships with people that are like you and with people that are not like you, and that work is so important to be in that relationship with yourself, movements, others, institutions, but then also folks who we need to bring in, not just all the folks who think like us. So when I started with RG, it had just recently changed from comfort zone to RG, and Tracy, the founder, had done an amazing job of really like what I will call the first phase of an organizational life cycle. I'm an OD geek. Is like, it was really like building the base. Like, we have an identity, we exist, we are okay, we are people. We deserve to have a place where we can talk about this money and figure out how to move it responsibly and talk about justice and liberation. That's okay for us to do. And so it was really more of the support network, and it had just beginning chapters, but there weren't like big programs yet. And so our work in that first kind of 3 to 4 years, I met a lot of folks like Mike and others who were like, yeah, I don't need the support as much right now. I'm really ready to organize. I'm ready to do stuff in family foundations. I'm ready to get out there. So we started the Donor Organizing Institute, then we started a family philanthropy track, then Classified, Karen and Allison Real Classified. And then the other place where we felt was really important to be was in mainstream philanthropy, because they were clamoring to talk to young people with wealth. What can we learn from young people with wealth? The transfer of wealth that's gonna happen. Young people, young people, young people. And we were like, sign us up, because I wanna put Mike Gast on that panel, or Karen Pittleman on that panel, or Allison Goldberg on the panel to talk about their wealth and talk about social change philanthropy, and that young people are gonna do this differently. And that work, I feel like, was critical to kind of also getting out there in the field. At the field at the time, Women Donors Network and Threshold just didn't speak to the young people issues, and also kind of, I really resonate with this kind of RG, really getting this mix of support and accountability, like wanting to have a space where we welcome everyone in and see people, and then also provide avenues for, like, political education over here, racial equity conversation here, talking about moving your money and what social change philanthropy is over here, and support networks. So kind of how to be that welcoming space and also have accountability around it. Just a couple more things. Am I at time?
Yeah.
I'm at time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep you wanting more. That's our goal.
Well, I want to start by telling you a little bit more about Laura Warnick and what, the conversation that we had that led me to that first MMC, sort of a frame for all the work that I was doing with RG at the time. So I was at Michigan. I was doing a ton of intergroup dialogue work, right, trying to figure out how do we talk about privilege, power, and difference? How do we talk about race? How do we talk about the intersections of all those things in class? And we were playing a game, like, some sort of game, and reflecting on it. And Laura had mentioned, she just made this sort of comment or this observation out of one of the experiences that, she was like, yeah, I'm a lesbian and I'm married to a woman, but we don't really have the same issue of worrying about insurance because we have money. We can pay for the things we need privately, right? Our wealth sort of buffers, our class privilege sort of buffers us from the worst effects, or some of the worst effects of of an experience of homophobia, right? Of the way that it's translated in our policy in the United States. And I said, you know what, Laura? I really resonate with that. Let's talk more about that. I'm a Black woman, but my experience with class and with having a little bit of money means that, yeah, I also don't experience the sort of worst effects of racism in the United States, right? When I look around, I'm not worried about my community being overly incarcerated. I'm not, many people in my family have PhDs. I just didn't, right? So there was a buffering that was happening, and that was the sort of beginning of really talking about class at the intersection of all of these other identities, right? That it's not just class alone, it's class and gender and class and race, right? All of the ways, all of the things that make us who we are have some sort of thread through class. And so we started talking. I joined on to her as a research assistant to her doctoral thesis. I went to MMC to kind of understand what are these rich kids up to. Changed my life, right? So I overlapped with Mike. I was on staff around 2009. I feel like that I was writing a book, so I'm like, when did I end? When did I not? I was on the board for a few years. But that sort of period in the early 2000s, we were really trying to kind of wrap our minds around what does it mean to have a multiracial organization? It's wonderful. It's actually critically important. And I will say this to the day that I die. It's actually critically important that we get white, wealthy people into the room fundamentally, right? Because you guys have the money, right? So, right? But at the same time, it doesn't represent a sort of a global perspective of who has control, who has resources, and maybe even more importantly, there's a lens, right? There's an analysis that intersectionality can really bring and sort of strengthen to the organizing, right? To think about how did all this money get accumulated this way in the first place? What is it for, right? Who does it subjugate? Who do we think should be performing the labor, and who do we think should be reaping the benefits, right? There's a racial dimension to that. What do women have to do with any of this, right? So just to be really thinking about all of these threads as they sort of are lived and sort of materialized in our society. So I came on to think about, well, how do we actually organize people of color into this movement? People who might be more reluctant to say, wait a minute now, my family just got the well. Wait a minute, this notion of giving it all away, I'm not so sure. Like, let's talk more, right? And how do we hold all those sort of messy, difficult contradictions? So one of the things we realized was we really needed to find a vehicle for people to be able to spend more time, like Hez said, building relationships with one another. Listening to everyone talk, it occurred to me that we haven't yet said out loud that like being in community is probably one of the biggest ways to break class isolation, right? That owning class, being wealthy is inherently a story of individualism. So, right, being here, coming together, seeing yourself as part of the movement is that first step to say, actually, like, I'm not alone. I can't do this all on my own. I need people. Everything that I've ever done, all the money that my family has ever made has been made in a large part by all these other people who often go unnamed. So we were thinking a lot about setting up what we called at the time, it's so fundamentally so sweet to think about, right? Praxis groups, very simple concept. Like, we need a space to reflect on all the things we're thinking about, right? And we need to make a commitment to each other over the course of however many sort of weeks we decided people needed to spend together. So in the chapters, right, my work, along with Mike's work and Jesse's work and Elspeth's work and the work of many other people, was to like find all the folks who wanted to spend consistent time together, get them together, right, set a nice agenda, have a sort of framework for like, how do you do this, and then figure out what would emerge out of that. That's it. The last thing I'll say is a lot of what emerged were small sort of funding circles that were taking on a particular issue and figuring out how to collectively move money together.
So yeah, I think there's only a couple of years between when Nicole left staff and when I joined the team. And yeah, I'm really coming up on, in June I will have been at RG for 10 years. And so like I will have like a decade of perspective on this organization. And I really think the last 10 years have been, I was talking with Hez at lunch, getting really clear about what it is we're trying to do, right? That we're definitely building on the work of all of the folks that came before us. When I was hired in the summer of 2015, the first, like a month into the job, we had what we called the Unicorn Campaign Summit. We were both trying to articulate a vision for our national campaign work, simultaneous to building our purpose for multiracial base building. And we saw that these two projects were so deeply connected, right? That if we were trying to build a multiracial base, we had to be about more than just give away all of your money, right? That we had to be working towards systemic change. We had to have ways for people to participate, whether they didn't currently have access, whether they were low access, right? That we were, that we were organizing all the folks in the top 10%, which also wasn't something that we were clear on, right? Like, but having that language of like we organize the top 10% also came about in the last 10 years. And so we articulated our campaign vision in 2015, which led us to another campaign summit in 2016, and then eventually selecting our national partners, the Movement for Black Lives and Center for Popular Democracy, and getting really clear. There was always this question of like, who's RG accountable to? And we'd be like, well, we have kind of like a multiracial, sometimes cross-class staff. You know, we have a very intentional board. But I think really like firming up those relationships with Popular Democracy and M4BL were a way to be like, these are the movement leaders and the movement organizations that we are following the strategy of. I think additionally during that time, we got a lot clearer about what our ask was around redistribution. We created the redistribution guidelines. Previously, we didn't really, when people were like, how much should I give away? We'd be like, how much feels bold and courageous? Sarah Abbott and a lot of folks on the Resource Mobilization Committee of the first National Member Council created the redistribution guidelines, saying that our vision is for folks to give away all or almost all, right, like unearned wealth. And we don't expect people to go from 0 to 100 overnight, right? Like if you are starting, if you're at this MMMC, right, and you haven't had a redistribution practice, right, like our goal is for you to start with what does 1 or 2% look like. Next year, we might come back and be like, okay, what does 6 or 7% look like? In a couple of years, we might ask you, what does your redistribution plan look like? But we don't expect you to have that today or at the end of this, of the next few days. We also got a lot clearer on our leadership trajectory. Like, what are the skills that we're actually trying to imbue our members with, right? And so getting clear that we actually have goals in terms of our competency around anti-racism and anti-classism, about telling our own stories, about redistribution, and about campaign work. And I think last but not least, we're this membership organization, but what voice and power do members have within the organization? And so over the last 10 years, we've iterated twice now with a National Member Council. And so we're in the second iteration of a National Member Council, and I think we're still figuring out how that body can be as empowered as possible. But the National Member Council now has seats on our board, and so we've gotten a lot clearer about like how members get to be really involved in the organization. And we've also just grown a ton, right? So when we launched the membership program in 2011, we had 135 dues-paying members. When I joined the team in 2015, we were at about 350, maybe close to 400 dues-paying members. And these days we have 1,000 dues-paying members. I think we kind of peaked in 2021, 2022 at 1,200 dues-paying members. But it's such tremendous, like we've quadrupled in size, right, in the last 10 years. We have 10x'd in size, right, in the last 15 years. And so our movement, I think, has just like grown so much, and we've built the infrastructure, right, to be able to hold folks, right? I think oftentimes people would get involved, they'd come for like 2 or 3 years and not really know what to do next, or how to plug in, or how to offer leadership. And I think that our chapters have really I think just created a lot of avenues for people to find meaningful roles, to grow new skills, to spend some time maybe working on a resource mobilization committee, and then spend some time on a campaign committee, and then maybe on central chapter leadership, and then maybe you're the rep to the National Member Council. And I think we just have so many more ways for people to be plugged in and stay plugged in. So I'll pause there.
That was exactly 5 minutes. You're incredible. Yaya's been practicing for months, drilling that. Just kidding. So This almost never happens with anything I do, but we're ahead of time. People. I will, but first we're going to take advantage of that by giving you a chance to, don't do it yet. Get up, find somebody else you have not talked to, and talk about what's new information here, what's interesting to you, and then we're going to pass out pieces of sticky stuff, and you have pens usually, but we also have pens out here, and you can start writing down some questions you might want to ask, and then we'll come back to a seat in about 3 to 5 minutes. So, but my question is, what else do you want this group to know about your era that you might have not had a chance to talk about? What other pieces do you want? And I'm going to start with Hez Norton, because we cut them off mid-idea. So let's get right to it.
Well, that idea's gone now, but I think what I wanted to say is, I haven't been connected to RG since 2005, and just being here and like reading the program book and there was something. I was just talking to Molly, who we were connected way back then. There's so much amazing work that's happened, and so much that is articulated that wasn't articulated back then. So just even being here and reading that program and coming to the opening plenary, like the work that has happened, Nicole, with your group, Mike, Elizabeth, like it's just flipping amazing. I feel like we were so much in trying to build something while also trying to fight something else, right? To talk about social change philanthropy rather than traditional philanthropy. It was like right around 9/11 was around then. George W. Bush was, so there was so many things that were going on that I feel like we moved on some things, but we did not move very far around racial equity. We did not move far around multiracial work. We were really focused on class. And to see some of the work that RG has done over this past 20 years is just pretty amazing to see. The other thing I wanted to say, which I always thought was kind of funny, there were several people during that period of time that asked if this was an organization for queer wealthy young people, which I kind of love. But I was like, no, it's okay if you're straight, anyone can join. I don't really know. I mean, Tracy's queer. There are a lot of folks in Haymarket that are queer, but I do feel like. In 2003 or 4, when we collaborated with Threshold and Women Donors Network to do a conference together, I remember this was a long time ago. People were not doing restroom stuff back then. And our constituency because we weren't membership back then, were going to all the bathrooms and changing all the signs. And the hotel staff and people at WDN and what were like, oh whoa, you can't do this, you can't do this. So that was RG in 2003, which really that didn't start until 2015, 16, if that. So just around gender justice, queer liberation, I just feel like RG's really been on the front lines in some of that. And some of my analysis around that is that a lot of queer folks that I've met that were in RG had already had a break from their families because they were queer. And they were like, I already had this break. I'm ready for another break. We broke, we repaired, or maybe we didn't, but I'm moving in this direction. There was other folks that I felt like there was some kind of break, and they were like, okay, I'm here, I'm ready to move. Now, that doesn't mean that was always the case. I don't mean to make a big thing, but I just wanted to note that. That's why.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll sort of pick up kind of where I left off, because I think it sort of leads so nicely from what Hez was saying the first time around this was a moment in time in which people were thinking, God, foundations really don't give in a way that would support or fund any kind of meaningful and sustained grassroots movement for racial or economic justice. People give 3-year grant. I'm in a nonprofit now as a journalist. And I think we're tackling the criminal justice system, and we get grants for 3 years, and I'm like, okay, so you want us to solve mass incarceration, and, so it just the notion of giving money over this short time horizon to solve problems or to make an impact on problems that have such an expansive history, it just doesn't really make sense. And so part of the work that people were doing in RG at the time was thinking about not only how do you influence foundations, how do you influence people who have family foundations to think about the rules around giving and how they give and all of that work, but also how do you create vehicles that would, fund things that wouldn't traditionally get support by big foundations, right? How can a community of young, wealthy people actually pull money, do it collaboratively, build skills, and create a sort of ethics of giving that would sustain a sort of movement? And it's really interesting I wasn't around, obviously, I left around 2014, 2015. I believe I stepped off of the board the same time that I joined the Washington Post. This unfortunate thing that as a journalist, you actually aren't a campaign activist. We're working that out in the industry right now, so stay tuned. We're figuring it out, yeah. But to think about all the things that came next, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, and thinking, maybe they did get a little bit of foundation money, but really the support for a movement like that comes from all the people in this room and all of the people who are not here, who've been part of this movement. Like that's the sort of infrastructure that it takes to get much more radical ideas, or ideas that push the needle, or sort of threaten institutions, funded and funded for the long haul. So people, in the era that I was in, were really thinking about what are the big issues that that aren't being resourced. I remember immigration being one. I'll say more about our work around taxes later. And they were doing it with the lens of that sort of racial equity, thinking about, how do you have movements or organizations that are multiracial, right, that really have a value system around that kind of leadership.
What Nicole was saying reminded me that in the pre-resource generation era that I was in, there was very much a discussion around how do you leverage liberal money? And actually June Mackley used to do a workshop called What's Hot and Underfunded. Everybody loved that. We always because you want to be on the cutting edge of things. But in fact, it was reading what were the emergent movements, the ones that weren't getting mainstream or other foundation support. In the 70s, domestic violence, the United Way, the local groups didn't fund that kind of stuff. That was all radical donors funding some of the early organizing on those issues. Then it became mainstream, and now it's mainstreamed in a sense. So, and then the other thing is, I think we were, there were international movements, the anti-apartheid movement, then, Central America, the U.S. policy in Nicaragua and El Salvador. That kind of created a sort of international lens that kind of dried up for a while, and now I think that the work around Palestine is kind of bringing back a kind of internationalist funding space. But that, that was something. And then the third thing I'll just mention is resources that we created. And I want to lift up this. I brought my one copy of Robin Hood Was Right. This is actually a later, the year 2000 edition, but there was a 1975 edition that was very important. I wasn't part of that one. I was part of this one. That kind of was a resource for people back when there wasn't an internet, and people found a book that then was a gateway into the organizing work. And I'll mention this. Ralph Nader called me up a couple years ago and said, I just bought 3 cases of Robin Hood Was Right at an auction for $10. Can I send them to you? So I have boxes of these in my barn. So I mentioned this last year. Give me your address, send me an email, and I'll send you a Robin Hood Was Right, because it has a bunch of the history that Mike was talking about, as well as how do you develop a giving plan, and some of the you'll get a flavor for the 24-year-old movement from 24 years ago from that, but there's still obviously some relevant things
there. I'm just taking in the history myself, and I think that the biggest thing in the last 10 years is that I think that our organizational posture, stance, confidence, I think really shifted. I think that the RG that I came into, we did this activity that some old heads on staff will remember at a retreat where we like described RG as a person. We really personified RG, and RG was, you know, like queer and young and mostly white, and was very concerned with doing the right thing, and can be a little bit of perfectionistic at times, and I think that with Ime's departure as executive director, they really named RG in their exit memo as necessary movement infrastructure. And I feel like I've got to be an ED that has really held that at the forefront during my entire tenure, is that we, at this point, we're a young people's organization, but we are not a young organization, that we are a really established anchor, right, like in the sector of funding social movements, right, that like Women Donors Network, alongside many of the regional social justice funds, are the only ones that are really older than us, right? Like all of these other formations, right? Like Movement Voters Project, Solidaire, Donors of Color Network, all of these are newer, and in many ways, many of them were started by RG alumni, right? That have gone on to do things that weren't possible within RG, or that they got inspired to do, and then they were 40 years old and wanted to do something else. And so I think just like the impact of RG is so clear at this point, right? I think also our movement partnerships with M4BL, with Popular Democracy, with other organizations like Thousand Currents and Grassroots International and Third Wave Fund, and many of the groups that you're going to be hearing from over this week, that we get reflected back to us over and over again. That's like RG donors are our favorite donors to work with, right? That like so much of the work that we're doing is because RG has directed people towards our work. And so I think I feel very confident going out into the world, right? The reputation of RG, right, like precedes whoever I am as the current executive director at this moment. And I think we're at a point where, yes, I think as Mike said, there's so much work for us to do, and I think we get to be like really proud of the organization that we've spent the last 25 years building, right? And that so many of these folks, right, like contributed to building. And so, yeah, I think alongside all of this clarity, once we started taking action on that clarity that we took many years to get to, I think also allowed us to be okay taking up a little bit more space, being actually kind of our experts, right, in how to get people to move, right? That it takes this combination of acknowledging our feelings, acknowledging our blocks, but then also having a community that's going to hold us accountable and provide us with tools to move through them, right? And so I think that's another big thing in the last 10 years.
Thank you, y'all. And thank you for sending up so many good questions. I've been trying to organize them here, and they're really excellent. I'm going to start with one that I thought was particularly interesting. The question is, and this is from someone in the crowd, obviously the right has many billionaires who are not giving away all or most of their wealth. If we, the people who get it, give away all our resources while their wealth exponentially compounds, how are we not making the problem even worse? Boom! That's the type of, that's good, that's a good question. Does anyone? Yeah, please.
Not my own.
Yeah.
As you recall, I was the one who raised the question of like, if we're gonna organize people of color into this movement, the notion that we want them to give away all their money doesn't necessarily resonate, that it's actually like a turn-off. So like, let's just think. So then I had a long conversation with one of the people who was pictured here before, Karen Piddleman, about what this actually means. Because I was like, Karen, I just like, help me get it, right? And one of the things that she said to me was, you know, we use this sort of terminology about redistribution, but we're also need to be more specific or explicit that when we talk about redistribution, we're actually talking about the vehicles of accumulation. But let me say that again, right? So it's not just like take the money, sell off all your stocks, and give it away. It's develop an analysis around the stock market and how it works. Develop an analysis around all of the vehicles that actually allow people to accumulate wealth. Think about pay disparity, right? In the time that I was at Resource Generation, we were thinking a ton about taxes. You saw people say, I'm the 1%, I stand with the 99%, right? That was an analysis that said, this notion that like rich old people can just die and give their money away to young people who can then keep, receiving compound interest on it for years, is that really fair without having to pay taxes on it, right? So it was a question, it was an indictment of the system itself that allows wealth to be locked up in these ways. And I think we're really in a moment where we can see that those people still, they're going strong. They're influencing elections, right? They're having an outsized influence. So I think it's maybe not as useful to think about this sort of binary, I keep it, I give it away. It's much more useful to interrogate the money, how it was made, where it came from, what systems, what industries, to develop a giving plan and a thought process that actually takes aim at that, right? So this isn't a movement just to say like, you're gonna return to the working class and your work is done. No, there's a whole economic system that upholds this in place. There's a ton of class patterns that like, even if I gave all my money away today, I'm sure more of it would find me later, right? I'm not even kidding, just based on the rules, right? So there's a lot of work to do. And so I think that like, so we get sort of caught in the notion of like, I'm zeroing out my bank account without remembering that like the work you're doing here, all of what you're gonna do this week and this weekend, and hopefully as you carry on into being members of RG, is really about that rigor and that analysis and really thinking about the system. Thank you, Kira.
As someone who actually did do that, gave it away, I totally agree with what Nicole is saying. I actually think it's how do you leverage the whole package for system change. So philanthropy is not the answer. Philanthropy is not a substitute for a tax system and a pre-distribution system that doesn't create these grotesque inequalities. How do we leverage this voice? There's a role we can play in changing the narratives around wealth. Deservedness. There's speaking out about tax policy, as Nicole's saying. That is ultimately going to be what changes the equation. There are billionaires giving huge amounts of wealth around to right-wing causes. Barry Side just gave, a couple billion dollars to the Federalist Society, the right-wing judicial organizing. So there's lots of money stepping up from the right-wing oligarchic side. We want to organize for that. We want to organize for redistributing in a charitable space, but we also want to change the rules that feed that system. So, I think that's where thinking, it's not just about a giving plan, it's about where do you want to use your voice, where do you want to use your family connections, where when it's right, where can you step into some of the campaigns around taxes, money in politics, and sort of add value to that. In Vermont, we had a proposal for a tax the wealthy ballot initiative, or not a ballot initiative, a legislative proposal to increase the top income tax rate. And the RG chapter in Vermont organized, we got 35 people who are going to pay that higher tax to come out and say, this is what it means to be a good neighbor in Vermont. If you have that kind of income, pay more taxes. And the RG chapter, John and others, they killed it, man. That was hugely important to the larger conversation and narrative about taxing wealth. So I think there's more to talk, and I would say, look at the Patriotic Millionaires, which has a different culture. It's mostly entrepreneurial wealth. They're not going to be, there's a sort of different culture. But they are very effectively changing tax rules. The reason the G20 is talking about a global wealth tax is because of patriotic millionaires organizing internationally. So that's the kind of thing you can plug into when you're ready. Same with Solidaire, hugely resource generation influenced at this point. And that's another vibrant network that you can be part. Do the work you need to do in resource generation, and then step into these other roles and other change agent processes?
I wanted to mention one thing here, and then I want to say, I noticed what time it is. I'm just going to say that I think, for me, the process of giving back wealth without anybody becoming a martyr, like I don't want anybody to martyr, and I want people to be thoughtful about repairing the damage of where the wealth has come from, and giving it back is about, it makes my life better. It's not about, and I still get to be a lifelong commitment to being part of multiracial working class movements, trying to win governing power from the billionaires that are trying to burn down the world. And when those are my people, I get to go after them. So there's something about like the redistribution that I think RG is encouraging is a totally selfish, self-interested act. It's about my life going better. It's about the poison that has been excess wealth in my family and trying to actually heal those relationships. And I want that for me and for everybody here, even, while we still take on these systems. So I'll say that. Man, there's so many good questions. I think I'm going to read these questions out loud, but I just don't think we're going to have time to, because I want to move on to this last question we have. Some of the questions that I want to make sure that Yaya, people are interested in is how and why did RG grow so much so fast? So I'm imagining that Yaya would get a chance to answer that, but they're not going to. But that's a good question that I think Yaya can bring. What are the RG supports or other similar organizing spaces to tap into after 35? I would love to answer that question. A bunch of people here can answer that question, and please come to us afterwards and we can talk about that. There is more and more of an ecosystem for people to get involved in. How do we convince family that redistribution is a good idea? There's a lot of people here to ask that question, and particularly Norton has been working with families and family foundations for a while, so they are one person that could talk to you about that. And then there was a question about mistakes and challenges. In each era, there's been huge mistakes, huge messes, huge challenge. This organization, like everyone, has been wildly imperfect. And I think everybody here and everybody on staff who's been in leadership could talk about what are the mistakes in our era and what we've learned from them. So definitely encourage you to follow up on that. As our last question for the panelists, I want to ask you all, we're in a particular moment in time right now. Trump just won this election. We have so many multiple crises right now. What from your era, we're coming together in just like a very unique political moment in the history of my life and in the world. What do you want this group to take with them from what you know about this work into the rest of the weekend? Maybe Yaya will go this. Actually, let's let Yaya end. Maybe that's good. So Chuck, we'll do that version again. I don't know. I'm making it up.
This is what happens with unclear leadership. This is an example of an unclear ask.
I think there's really two things that I would raise up. One, like I said, about the giving circles as an alternative to the institutions that did exist and were funding in ways that we were like, you guys could do better. But I do think that this is really a moment for alternatives, a moment for close-knit communities, for people thinking locally, for people sort of moving and operating with the people closest to them, while the mega institutions that are sort of melting down, melt all the way down. And then we get to build them again based on the work that we cultivated from sort of the small seed. And so that's sort of my personal articulation or personal understanding of what we're really looking at, that I think we're going to actually be in this for quite some time. And I think that it's necessary in some ways to get to the other side, as unfortunate as that sort of feels, but that the work doesn't stop, the scale just changes. And then the other thing is man, we were really trying to figure out how to get rich people excited about a campaign for taxes. Desperately so, it was so important. We had come out of Occupy Wall Street. I think Warren Buffett was he talking about the death tax? All of the death tax commentary, right? So we were just this is so critical. The way that money moves through our tax system, all the loopholes, all of it. And so I think fast forward to where we are now, I just see the effects of a tax policy, and Trump's big thing, right, is further changing the tax codes. I was at the Washington Post in 2017 when Paul Ryan got his big tax cut through, and I actually distinctly remember crying that night because I understood there was a way that I was like the enormity of what this means and how it changes things for a generation. And so to be where we are today. So all that is to say is, like, if you can figure out how to get people excited about taxes, by all means, we gotta get excited about taxes. Because they're really important. There's lots of other things to be excited about, but that's one thing that I just think is so critical.
Gosh. 2017, the tax scam. I was alongside many RGers with our partners at Popular Democracy getting arrested, right, interrupting the Senate proceedings there, right? And so I think RG has a role, right, to show up as a part of this multiracial cross-class, right, the coalition that is going to be a part of the resistance, to be, protesting, showing up, doing direct action. I can't get arrested in DC anymore, so other people are also going to need to step up. I have 2 more years, and then I can start getting arrested in DC again. I'll kind of answer the question of, this feels connected to the question of growth, right? Tammy, during an organizing team call, talked about the movement cycles, right? And I don't think that the election was a trigger moment, right? For a trigger moment being like a mass paying attention moment. People are starting to get really involved, right? Like for us, right, the Black Lives Matter movement of 2014 and 2015, I think, was one of those moments where a lot of people got involved. I think Trump's first election in 2016 was a big moment where a lot of people got involved. 1 minute, oh my gosh. 2020. Anyway, so I don't think that moment has happened yet. I think that moment is going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. I think there's broad discontent. I think something big is going to happen, and a lot of people are going to be looking for direction and how to be plugged in, and I think we got to be ready to welcome them in and show them how to be a part of movement. And y'all, even if you're new right now, in 6 months, y'all are going to be the old hats, and we're going to have to show the new people.
For me, what comes to mind is just courage. Like, what does courage look like right now? What does courage look like around your giving? What does courage look like around conversations with family? What is courageous leadership for each of us right now, myself included, which I'm trying to figure out. Because what's about to happen is scary as shit for a lot of people in this country, and it's been happening for a while. And yes, like, I understand all that. And what does courageous leadership look like right now? And what are all, like Nicole and Chuck were saying, and Yaya, like, what are all the different levers that we have? Because it's not all about money. It's about so much more. And what are all the things that we can do together? And our movements need more funding, and they need love, and they need trust, and they need relationship, and they need partnering, and they need flanking. I think I was on something where there was a lot of language around flanking. They need flanking and understanding. And how do we bring that and show up courageously at this time? And that's what I feel like RG does and will continue to do.
Yeah, just in that same spirit, I think we're entering into a phase of resistance where building solidarity, mutual aid, and resilience in wherever you are is going to be important, and cross-class and cross-race, and just kind of finding those relationships and building on that. And I would say, though, from a resource generation, where is our unique leverage? Where do we have the most leverage given our experience of wealth? Is Susanna Penfield here? Oh yeah, I saw you. The mask. Yeah. Okay. So who else knows what a trust is? I mean, some of us are trying to figure that out, and understand how trusts as a financial instrument are being used to sequester and hide trillions, tens of trillions of the world's wealth. We talk about the levels of inequality in the billionaires today. It's grossly underestimated because so much wealth is now moved off the ledger into the shadows. Who best to disrupt the trust system So Suzanne is like a leader in thinking about this, what started as a little group called Busted, breaking up sequestered trusts and endowments. That's an issue that is very personal, where we could have a lot of leverage. Nicole mentioned taxes, taxing the rich. It's the man bites dog story, person bites dog story that keeps giving. Whenever wealthy people say, well, I should pay more taxes, all of a sudden you have a platform to talk about what kind of world you want to live in, what kind of society. That's a unique leverage place for us. So looking for those unique kind of places where wealthy people's voices can shift the narrative. And sign up for Michael's blog, where it lives on. The ecosystem lives on.
Thanks, y'all. The one lesson I wanted to say from my work is that that I want to offer to all of you and for us to figure out together is how do we get more Main Street wealthy people curious and interested about joining us, not just in RG, but in this work generally. How do we go after those relationships? How do we go after the Trump voters in our family? How do we go after more mainstream, norm-core rich people that might not look good to us, but are our special thing that we have those relationships, and we can bring them in and ask them questions like the good organizers we are. And then how can we fall in love with each other enough to get through this next period together? Because and we don't know what to do next. You know, none of us know exactly how to face what's coming, but I think the more we can fall in love with each other, the better it will go. So thank you so much for this. This is such a good If you want to return the favor of us being up here, if you could let any of us know what you appreciated, what you took away, I'd be so curious to know from all of this what's sticking with you. We don't have time to do that right now, but I'd love to hear. And I'll pass it now over.